Tom Pires had soft hands for a man who would help destroy an empire. He was an apothecary by training, a keeper of remedies and powders employed by the Portuguese crown to catalog the drugs and spices of the East. He arrived in Lisbon in 1511 carrying notes that would become the Summa Oriental, the most detailed European account of Asian trade ever written at that point. He described the markets of Malacca with the precision of a man who had stood in them, counted the sacks, smelled the air, and near the center of everything he described was pepper. Black, wrinkled, light enough to carry in a fist, worth more per pound in a Lisbon warehouse than a laborer earned in 3 months. Pires understood something that the merchants financing his voyage had spent decades trying to grasp. Pepper was not valuable because it was rare in the way a gemstone is rare. It grew across a broad arc of southern Asia, from the Malabar coast of India through Sumatra and Java and into the islands beyond. The pepper was everywhere. What made it expensive in Europe was the distance, and the hands it passed through, and the violence required to keep those hands from closing too tightly around the supply. He wrote that down. He noted it carefully. Then, he sailed to China as Portugal's first ambassador to the Ming court, and he never came home. The Chinese imprisoned him. He died somewhere in Guangzhou around 1540, still waiting for an audience that never came. His notes survived him by centuries. The trade he described outlasted every empire that tried to control it. Pepper is the most traded spice in human history. It still is. More than 600,000 metric tons move through global markets every year. It sits on every table in every restaurant in every country where people eat food prepared by other people, which is to say, everywhere. It is so ordinary now that it requires effort to understand what it once cost, not in money, in lives. The Malabar coast of southwestern India, the region now called Kerala, produced the pepper that fed the ancient world's obsession. The plant is a vine, Piper nigrum, which climbs trees or wooden stakes and produces small round drupes that are harvested before they fully ripen, then dried in the sun until they shrivel into the black peppercorns still sold in grocery stores today. The farmers who grew it in the 1st century were called Edzhava, a caste of cultivators who had tended the vine for generations. They sold to Arab merchants who worked the monsoon winds across the Arabian Sea, loading their dhows at Calicut and Cochin and riding the seasonal winds to the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. From there, overland routes carried pepper into Egypt, into Rome, into the cities of the Mediterranean world. Rome consumed pepper in quantities that still seem implausible. Apicius, the 1st century Roman cookbook author, included pepper in nearly every recipe, savory and sweet alike. Roman physicians prescribed it for digestive complaints, fevers, and eye conditions. The elder Pliny complained in 77 AD that Rome spent 50 million sesterces per year importing pepper and other spices from India, money that left the empire and did not return. He considered it a scandal. The pepper kept arriving anyway. When Alaric the Visigoth besieged Rome in 408 AD, his ransom demand included 3,000 pounds of pepper alongside gold and silver. His negotiators did not treat this as an odd request. Pepper was portable, stable, concentrated wealth. It did not spoil. It did not corrode. A sack of peppercorns in the 5th century was as close to hard currency as anything organic could be. Rents in medieval Europe were sometimes paid in pepper. The English word peppercorn rent originally described a genuine payment, not the nominal formality it became later. The Arab merchants, who controlled the Malabar trade, understood their position exactly. They maintained it through a combination of commercial skill, navigational knowledge, and careful misdirection. For centuries, they told European buyers that pepper grew in forests guarded by serpents, that harvesting required fire to drive the snakes away, that the smoke darkened the peppercorns. This story appears in Greek texts from the 1st century BC. it was still circulating in European monasteries 1,000 years later. It was entirely fabricated. The Malabar pepper gardens had no serpents worth mentioning. The story existed to explain why Europeans should not try to go there themselves. For most of those 1,000 years, the strategy worked. The pepper traveled through Arab intermediaries to Alexandria, then to Venetian merchants who had secured trading rights in Egypt, then north through the Alpine passes into the cities of France and Germany and England. Each pair of hands added a margin. By the time peppercorns reached a market stall in Paris or London, they had passed through perhaps a dozen commercial transactions. The final price bore little relationship to the price paid to the farmer in Kerala. Venice grew rich on this arrangement. Not merely comfortable, not prosperous in the ordinary sense, but spectacularly, architecturally, institutionally rich. The Venetian state funded its naval power, its glass industry, its diplomatic corps, its entire civic infrastructure partly on the margin between the purchase price in Alexandria and the sale price in Northern Europe. Pepper was not the only commodity that flowed through Venice, but it was the one whose volume and value most reliably underpinned the city's commercial dominance. When Venetian merchants negotiated with the Mamluk sultans of Egypt, access to the pepper supply was the central issue on the table. Portugal ended this arrangement. The ending was not quick, and it was not clean, and it required a level of sustained violence that contemporaries found remarkable, even by the standards of 15th century warfare. The Portuguese project began under King John I and accelerated under his son Henry. The prince, history calls the navigator, though he personally navigated very little. Henry funded expeditions down the African coast starting in the 1420s, not primarily in search of pepper, but in search of gold and enslaved people, and a route around the Muslim intermediaries who controlled the overland trade. The pepper calculation came later, when it became clear that Africa's western coast eventually ended and that a ship sailing far enough south would find open ocean, and, beyond that, India. Bartolomeo Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama sailed from Lisbon around the Cape and north along the East African coast, where he hired an Arab navigator named Ahmad ibn Majid to guide him across the Indian Ocean to Calicut. Da Gama arrived on the Malabar coast in May 1498. He was the first European to reach India by sea. He loaded his ships with pepper and cinnamon and sailed home. The cargo paid for the voyage 60 times over. What happened next is where the history of pepper becomes something harder to look at directly. Da Gama returned to Calicut in 1502 with a fleet of 15 ships and explicit instructions to establish Portuguese trading dominance by force if negotiation failed. Negotiation failed almost immediately. The Zamorin of Calicut, the regional ruler, had no intention of displacing the Arab merchants who had traded with his port for centuries. Da Gama responded by seizing a ship carrying 400 Muslim pilgrims returning from Mecca, locking the passengers and crew below decks, and burning the ship. He then bombarded Calicut from the sea for 2 days. He cut off the hands, ears, and noses of 38 fishermen captured near the port, loaded the pieces into a boat with a note telling the Zamorin he could use the pieces to make a curry, and sent the boat ashore. The historical record contains this account in multiple sources. It is not disputed. It appears in Portuguese chronicles written by men who considered da Gama a hero. The mutilations were intended as a message, and the message was understood. Portugal wanted the pepper trade, and Portugal was willing to do whatever the trade required. Over the following decade, Portugal established a chain of fortified trading posts along the Indian Ocean rim. Afonso de Albuquerque captured Goa on the Malabar coast in 1510, massacring the city's Muslim population over 3 days. He captured Malacca in 1511, the same year Tome Pires arrived there to take notes. Malacca was the central node of the eastern spice trade, the point where the products of the Spice Islands met the merchants of India and China and the Arab world. Albuquerque took it in 6 weeks. He killed thousands. He expelled the Javanese and Arab traders who had operated there for generations. Portugal now controlled the physical choke points of the pepper trade. Ships leaving the Indian Ocean had to pass through waters patrolled by Portuguese warships. Merchants who attempted to move pepper without Portuguese licenses faced confiscation or death. The Estado da India, Portugal's seaborne empire, was not a trading company with military support. It was a military apparatus that collected revenue through trade. The price of pepper in Lisbon dropped. This was the intended result. Portugal undersold Venice by enough to pull buyers north and west. Venice did not collapse overnight, but its commercial dominance in the pepper trade ended within a generation. The Republic survived by diversifying, by developing its manufacturing base, by finding other commodities. But the specific wealth that had funded the Doge's palace and the Arsenal and the Rialto market came from a system that Portugal had broken. Tomé Pires, writing his notes in Malacca in 1512, observed that whoever controlled Malacca had their hands on the throat of Venice. He did not use those exact words. He wrote that the man who was lord of Malacca had his hands on the throat of Venice. It was a precise observation. He had done the accounting himself. The farmers growing pepper in Kerala experienced Portugal's arrival differently from the Venetian merchants who lost market share. Da Gama's method of price negotiation involved anchoring warships in the harbor and threatening bombardment. The Zamorans of Calicut fought back, sometimes successfully, for decades. The pepper farmers themselves had limited options. They sold to whoever was buying at whatever price the buyer was willing to enforce. The Arab merchants, who had paid fair prices and maintained long relationships, were gone or marginalized. The Portuguese paid less and collected more, and the collection involved men with firearms stationed at the port. The yield from this system was substantial. Between 1500 and 1600, Portugal extracted wealth from the Indian Ocean trade, equivalent to several times the annual revenue of the Portuguese crown at the start of the century. Pepper represented the largest single component of that extraction. The proceeds funded Portuguese expansion into Brazil, into Africa, into the Atlantic island colonies. The architecture of Lisbon, the monasteries, the azulejo tiles, the Torre de Belém, standing at the mouth of the Tagus where the pepper ships returned. All of it was built on a commodity that grew on vines in Kerala and Sumatra, tended by farmers who saw almost none of that wealth. The false resolution arrived around 1580. Portugal's pepper monopoly appeared secure. The Estado de India had beaten back the Ottomans, suppressed the Arab trading networks, established forts at every strategic point from Mozambique to Macau. The pepper was flowing. The margins were holding. Then the Dutch arrived. The Dutch Republic was fighting for its independence from Spain, which had absorbed Portugal in 1580 under Philip II. Spanish control of Lisbon meant Spanish control of the pepper supply, which meant that the Protestant merchants of Amsterdam who had previously bought pepper through Lisbon now faced embargoes and interruptions. They decided to go to the source themselves. The first Dutch fleet reached the Banda Islands in 1595. It returned in 1597 with enough pepper and nutmeg to cover the expedition's costs. The second fleet was larger. The third was larger still. By 1602, the Dutch Republic had consolidated its competing trading companies into the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, which was not a company in any modern sense. It was a sovereign entity. It had the legal right to make treaties, wage war, imprison and execute people, and coin money. It was a state that happened to organize itself around commerce rather than a state that happened to support commerce. The VOC's methods in the Spice Islands were, if possible, more systematically brutal than Portugal's had been. In the Banda Islands, the primary source of nutmeg, the VOC under John Peter Zune. Cohen killed or enslaved the entire indigenous population between 1621 and 1622. The Bandanese numbered around 15,000 people at the start of Cohen's campaign. Roughly 1,000 survived, mostly those who had managed to flee to neighboring islands. Cohen then repopulated the islands with Dutch colonists, who were given parcels of land and a fixed number of enslaved laborers to work them, creating a plantation system designed to produce nutmeg for the Amsterdam market at a controlled price. Cohen considered this a business solution. He wrote to the VOC Board of Directors in Amsterdam, explaining that the Bandanese had repeatedly violated their contracts and that the elimination of the indigenous population was necessary to secure the supply chain. The board was not entirely comfortable with the methodology, but they accepted the results. The nutmeg flowed. Pepper was harder to monopolize than nutmeg because it grew in more places. The Malabar Coast, Sumatra, Java, Borneo all produced exportable quantities. The VOC established contracts with local rulers backed by the credible threat of force that required exclusive sale to the company at fixed prices. Rulers who agreed were protected and paid. Rulers who sold to other buyers had their ports blockaded or their cities bombarded. The system was not perfectly efficient. Smuggling continued. English traders found gaps in the Dutch coverage. But the VOC controlled enough of the supply to set the European price for most of the 17th century. The English East India Company, founded 2 years before the VOC in 1600, spent its first decades competing for the same trade. The two companies fought each other in the waters around Sumatra and Java and the Moluccas, sometimes through commercial competition, sometimes through naval engagements. In 1623, Dutch forces in Ambon tortured and executed 10 English employees of the East India Company on charges of conspiring against the VOC. The English called it a massacre. The Dutch called it a judicial proceeding. The incident ended serious English competition for the eastern spice trade. The English East India Company shifted its focus westward, toward the Indian subcontinent, toward cotton textiles, toward the territory that would eventually become the British Raj. The history of British India begins, in part, with a dispute over pepper. By 1700, the pepper trade had changed its shape again. The VOC's monopoly was eroding as pepper cultivation spread to new regions. English and French planters introduced the vine to their Caribbean colonies with limited success. More significantly, pepper cultivation expanded in Sumatra beyond the areas the VOC could effectively police. Free traders, smugglers, and local rulers who had grown tired of VOC terms found ways to move pepper to markets outside the company's network. The price of pepper in Europe fell through the 18th century. Not catastrophically, not overnight, but consistently. The commodity that had financed da Gama's fleet and built the Venetian Republic and funded the VOC's three-masted warships became, slowly, something ordinary. The farmers in Kerala still grew it. The vine still climbed its stakes. The drupes were still harvested green and dried in the sun. But the marginal price per pound no longer justified warfare at the scale pepper had once generated. Salem, Massachusetts, built its early merchant wealth on the pepper trade. The port's ships made direct voyages to Sumatra beginning in 1797, buying pepper from Atsanese traders and selling it in American and European markets, bypassing the colonial structures that had controlled the trade for 2 centuries. Between 1797 and 1846, Salem's merchants made at least 1,000 voyages to Sumatra. At one point, in the early 19th century, Salem was paying 5% of total United States customs revenue, almost all of it from pepper. A small New England port with no colonial territory and no naval empire had found a way into the trade simply by showing up with cash and ships when the old monopolies had weakened enough to allow it. The Atsanese traders who supplied Salem's ships were not passive recipients of American commercial interest. They negotiated hard, understood their leverage, and in at least 2 cases attacked American vessels they believed had cheated them. In 1831, the Achinese killed the captain and several crew members of the brig Friendship. President Andrew Jackson sent a naval punitive expedition to bombard the town of Kuala Batu. American gunboats shelling a Sumatran pepper port in 1832 is not a detail that appears in most accounts of Jacksonian America. It happened nonetheless. The Industrial Revolution did not reduce pepper's importance so much as it democratized it. When mechanized food processing began producing the preserved meats, the canned goods, the manufactured condiments that fed the urban working classes of industrial Europe and America, pepper went into everything. Not as a luxury, as a basic input. The spice that Alaric had demanded as ransom was now being measured into sausage casings by the ton. The quantity consumed increased, while the prestige value collapsed. This is the pattern that runs through the entire history of pepper. The violence was never really about pepper. It was about the margin between what something cost where it grew and what someone would pay for it somewhere else. The pepper was the occasion. The gap was the cause. When the gap closed, the violence found other justifications, other commodities, other geographies. The Estado de India turned its attention to gold and ivory. The VOC moved into textiles and coffee. The English East India Company became a territorial power. The structure outlasted the spice. Tom Pires, the apothecary with soft hands, understood this before most of his contemporaries. He saw that controlling the trade meant controlling the choke points, and controlling the choke points required a willingness to do things that the trade's beneficiaries preferred not to think about too carefully. He documented it with the precision of a man trained to read labels, to measure doses, to record what was actually in the jar rather than what the label claimed. Then China locked him up, and he died waiting for an audience that was never going to happen. His book survived. The Summa Oriental was eventually published in 1944, 4 centuries after he wrote it. The pepper it described had by then been available in every grocery store in the world for generations. The distance between its price and the cost of the lives spent controlling it had been forgotten so thoroughly that recovering it requires looking up sources most people will never read. Whether the specific trade networks Pires documented in Malacca in 1512 represent an irreplaceable commercial system destroyed by European intervention, or a pre-existing structure of coercion that Portuguese force simply replaced with a different structure of coercion, is a question economic historians have not resolved. The Achinese, who traded with Salem's merchants, the Bandanese who were killed by the VOC, the Malabar farmers who sold to whoever was pointing the cannons, would probably have considered the distinction academic.